Buenas tardes a todas y a todos. Vamos a comenzar con el Plenario III Modelos de regulación de privacidad. La protección de datos personales cuenta con regulaciones específicas en diversas partes del mundo que han obedecido a diferentes motivaciones, acordes con la realidad socio-económica, política y jurídica de cada país o región. Es posible identificar modelos de regulación basados en distintos enfoques y perspectivas, ya sea enfatizando el derecho a la protección de datos como un derecho fundamental o protegiendo los derechos de los consumidores. Es así que resulta fundamental el análisis de las buenas prácticas y de los diversos modelos de privacidad con el objetivo de evaluar e intercambiar experiencias, enriqueciéndose con los aspectos positivos de cada uno de ellos. Permítanme presentarles a quien será el moderador de este segmento, el señor Jacob Constant, presidente del Comité Ejecutivo de la conferencia. Los expositores invitados son la señora Julie Brill, Federal Trade Commission de Estados Unidos, el señor Alan Chiang, Organismo de Protección de Datos de Hong Kong, y el señor Giovanni Buttarelli, adjunto del Supervisor Europeo de Protección de Datos. Adelante usted.
Thank you very much. Before addressing you about the subject, I would want also to introduce Bruno Giancarelli, who is head of the sector for international relations of DG Justice of the European Commission. We have asked him to sit on this panel specifically because if we want to make the tour du monde, and I'm going to explain later on, we would want to have someone from the European Commission on board who will be able to tell us what the proposals in the new European EU data protection framework are as far as the international data transport or data flow is concerned. And I have asked him to come on board. He will be one of the main speakers, so to say, in the next session, but I'm glad that he was allowed to be here, sitting here. Now, welcome back to the first plenary session after lunch. It's a great pleasure to moderate the session in which the privacy regulation models of the different parts of the world will be discussed. Sort of tour du monde. The world of data protection and privacy is changing considerably. 20 years ago, we lived in a world in which the internet was not yet available to most people. Today, internet is accessible to anyone at any time and nearly from anywhere. The legal landscape, however, differs across the world, both due to cultural differences and legal traditions. In Western Europe, the French Revolution had put the individual at the center of society, but later on, in the second half of the last century, state security services like Nazi Gestapo, etc., made European citizens very much aware of the risks attached to the processing of personal data by governments. Therefore, it is perhaps not very surprising that the member states of the European Union decided to recognize the right to data protection as a fundamental right for all its residents by including it in the European Charter on Fundamental Rights. This is different from the consumer rights perspective in the United States, and it's also different from APIC cross-border privacy enforcement arrangements. These differences do, however, not really matter when you consider the great challenges posed to the right to data protection and privacy by the technological developments of recent decades all over the world. And when looking at the bigger picture, you indeed can detect a trend that data protection and privacy rules across the world get closer to each other, at least in some areas, for example, with regard to principles of transparency and accountability. In other areas, unfortunately, differences remain. Now, for the session that will follow, like I said, we will make a tour du monde, so to say APEC, United States and Europe, APEC and United States on my right hand and Europe on my left hand, and we have agreed that we will answer 2, or if you wish, 3 questions. The one is, what is the situation in your, let's call it, region at this very moment? And secondly, what are the differences that then come across between the several regions, and how can we get these differences to be workable? So that although we're all missionaries of our own laws and legal framework, we will decide how to strive to the best result for all people around the world, no matter of legal differences. If the desire is there, and if the political will is there, we will be able to make our legal systems work together and to really achieve globalized data protection. Now let me end by saying that as a youngster, I was very much a fan of the Beatles. I didn't understand what they were singing about, so that's why I learned English to start off. But secondly, their songs still are very valuable in my life, and I'm going to sing part of one of the Beatles' songs for you to start this session. I'm not going to say all together now, maybe we could, but this is where it goes. Life is very short, and there's no time for fussing and fighting, my friend. I have always thought that it's a crime, so I will ask you once again, try to see it my way. Only time will tell if I am right or I am wrong. While you see it your way, there's a chance that we might fall apart before too long. We can work it out, we can work it out. Well, on the panel, like is introduced to start of, first, Julie Brill, FTC. I'm not sure whether she's going to sing or address you, but I'll leave it to her. Julie.
Thank you. Well, I promise you I will do you all the favor of not singing. Although that was a wonderful rendition, Jakob, so it was really great. Well, first of all, and most importantly, thank you to our Uruguayan hosts. They are putting on a marvelous conference. I know how much work this is, and I just want to thank them for all the great work that they've done in bringing us all together. I too am of a certain age, and maybe I was on the tail end of the Beatles phenomenon, but I was definitely a big fan. And we can work it out as a great metaphor for, I think, where we need to go and what we need to start to think about. There's another one that's out there, and in light of the number of empty chairs that I see, I think it's probably something that some of you have, or some of our missing friends have taken to heart. But it is a good, I think, meme, as we say in this space, both literally and metaphorically, and that is in light of the weather that we had yesterday versus the weather that we have today. Here comes the sun. I think that one works too. So let me just turn, if I can, to just a description of what's going on in the United States and how it is that we approach privacy. And some of you, of course, are very well familiar with this, but I think it's worth highlighting some of the work that we've done, particularly over the last couple of years, to bring vigorous privacy enforcement and policy making efforts to this issue. So, as many of you do know, a number of agencies in the United States do have a piece or a role in enforcement of privacy laws. But the Federal Trade Commission, where I'm a commissioner, is the leading privacy regulator in the commercial sector in the United States. We enforce laws relating to financial information, children's privacy, health information, credit reporting, and a lot more. Our principal law is known as the Federal Trade Commission Act, which allows us to take strong action against unfair and deceptive acts and practices in connection with data security and privacy. So recently we've had 2 high-profile cases, of which many of you are aware, involving Google and separately Facebook. And they're good examples of the kind of work that we can and do. Both companies, both Google and Facebook, are now under comprehensive consent orders that require them to establish comprehensive privacy programs and to obtain audits of their privacy programs for the next 20 years. Now, in August of this year, we alleged that Google violated this order by making misrepresentations in connection with tracking cookies. Google settled those charges by paying $22.5 million in civil penalties. That's the largest penalty amount that the FTC has ever obtained with respect to the violation of a consent order in any area, privacy or any other. Now, I'm going to add that both Google and Facebook, with respect to both of those cases, we did charge the companies with violating the notice and choice principles of the EU-US Safe Harbor. So the orders now require them, of course, to comply with those provisions of the EU-US Safe Harbor, and both orders extend, therefore, to protecting consumers not only in the United States, but literally all around the world. But our work doesn't just focus on the biggest and most well-known companies. We have brought many enforcement actions against less well-known players in the online ecosystem, including ad networks, mobile apps, data analytic companies, data brokers, credit reporting agencies, and software developers. Now, these cases might not be as well known, but they're very important because they help industry understand how companies throughout the ecosystem should design and implement their products and services within the boundaries of U.S. law. Now, in addition to enforcement, as I mentioned a moment ago, we also work to protect consumers through policy initiatives. We've issued a comprehensive new privacy framework where we call for companies to abide by 3 principles: privacy by design, simplified choice, and greater transparency. And as Jakob mentioned, I think that there are some similarities between some of the things that we're calling for and some of the things that the Europeans are putting into their proposed efforts as well. But what we've done at the FTC is we've drilled down further into these 3 basic principles to help industry figure out how they can apply them in some of the most cutting-edge areas. Just this Monday, just a couple of days ago, we issued a report on facial recognition technologies. We set out in that report some best practices around the use of facial recognition technologies that can be used by anyone in this space that's trying to develop these kinds of technologies. We also recently provided guidance to the mobile app community on how it can incorporate our 3 basic principles into app development and marketing. And of course, in our call for industry to develop a do-not-track mechanism, our 3 privacy principles are at the core of the goals that we have set out for a sufficiently robust notice and choice mechanism for online tracking through do-not-track. Now look, of course there's more work to do, including, in the United States, enacting comprehensive privacy legislation, which a majority of the Federal Trade Commission has called for, as well as the Obama administration calling for it, and also addressing cross-border enforcement and data flows. So it's great to be here today to talk about the different models in place and how we can try to strive to make them interoperable. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Julie. I give the floor to Alan, who will talk about the APA situation. Alan, go ahead.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to explain a little bit about what happens or what has happened in the past few years in the protection of personal data in the Asia-Pacific region. I'll talk about 2 initiatives that was originally taken up by the ministers for various reasons. One being the recognition of the importance of protecting personal data, and secondly, because of the recognition that there is a need to facilitate electronic commerce, and there's a need also to promote cross-border transfer of data within the region. The first initiative is what we call the APEC Cross-Border Privacy Enforcement Arrangement, CPEA. The purpose of this initiative is to facilitate information sharing among the privacy enforcement authorities within the region, and also to encourage information sharing and cooperation on privacy investigations. So under this mechanism, the privacy enforcement authorities can jointly or can carry out in parallel investigations against a particular company. This initiative has been installed some 2 years ago. As of today, there are 22 privacy enforcement authorities enrolled in this scheme, and they come from countries like USA, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Korea, Mexico, Japan, and Hong Kong being part of China. Right, that's the first initiative. Second one I'd like to talk about is, again, also an initiative by the ministers of APEC, and that's what we call the Cross-Border Privacy Rules System, CBPRs. This is an enforceable code of conduct for business companies to transfer consumer data across the region, the APEC countries. The transfer has to follow a set of what we call the APEC privacy principles we formulated ourselves. In order to get enrolled in the system, there are two prerequisites. First of all, you need to have a privacy enforcement authority which belongs to the APEC CPEA arrangement, a system that I just talked about. And secondly, you need to have at least one accountability agent established within the jurisdiction. And what is meant by accountability agent? It's a sort of a trusted party which certifies the whether a company is accepted under the APEC privacy principles for the purpose of transfer of cross-border data within the region. So in case a company wishes to apply for membership of this system, they have to have accreditation on an annual basis certified by this accountability agent. We have actually, this is a very new initiative within the region. All the mechanisms has just been installed. The documentation has just been ready. The first country or economy that has applied for this enrollment within the system is US, and the second applicant is Mexico. So this is a very new system. As I said, we haven't had actual operating experience so far, maybe in a year's time, and then we can quote actual examples of how this system works in practice. So much about the theoretical system of this APEC initiatives. If time allows, I talk about what has happened among the privacy enforcement authorities ourselves. We had among the privacy enforcement authorities within the region an informal organization, what we call APA, Asia Pacific Privacy Agencies within the region. We have been holding meetings twice a year, and we make use of these meetings and the meetings in between these formal meetings to exchange information, share best practices, and also to promote cooperation in enforcement and promotion work. Just to give you an example of what we have done recently, the Google privacy policy changes, the upper jurisdictions were also very active in this area. We wrote to Google and we negotiate with them, we seek clarifications. As a result, we thought we have achieved some significant improvements in what they have initially formulated 1st of March this year. We are also in close liaison with what's happening elsewhere outside the region, including CNIL. We have given, for example, the endorsement to what CNIL has formulated in terms of recommendations in their report on the investigation in this area. And we will continue to monitor Google's improvements within the region and also what they have done as a result of investigations outside the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. Now we go to the European side. Giovanni first.
Yes, thanks. Of course, I'm grateful to the Data Protection Authority of Uruguay for having organized such a plenary session, which I consider in terms of continuity with plenary slot 4 I chaired last year in Mexico City. They told me that some newcomers in the area of data protection, new faces are around, so it would be perhaps the case to briefly describe, subject to time limits, the trends in Europe. I have prepared, along the music of All We Need Is Love, a text. I cannot compete with Jacob, so the sound will be provided in private. I will only focus on the text. To say that the European approach to privacy has been built upon the gradual recognition that while the right to privacy includes certain elements of data protection, it is, however, not exactly the same as to the right to data protection. Since the 50s, privacy has been recognized as a fundamental right, not only in Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, while in the 80s, in the wake of the development of the computer technologies, a separate right has emerged in recognition of new challenges these technologies raise on individual freedoms. And this has led to not only the signature of the Convention 108 and its long ratification process, but also to the adoption of two directives, partly amended more recently. As a result of this European approach, now privacy and data protection are considered into separate rights with different scopes. And now Europe is upgrading, and this is a crucial moment for data protection. We are going to discuss a package, a consistent package. We, as data protection authorities, largely support, although there is a margin for maneuver for many adjustments and some substantive changes. Why we are insisting on a legal framework? First, because there is a need to update the current legal framework to integrate some challenges posed by the use of internet and its interconnectivity to other mobile technologies. Second, it's time to make this legal framework more effective as well as more consistent. So the trend is to keep the current principles and to make them more effective in practice by also introducing new principles such as privacy by design, privacy by default, and accountability as well. So the package aims at legal level at strengthening the rights of individuals and making controllers more accountable for what they do about personal data protection. And furthermore, the role and powers of national DPAs alone and together are effectively reinforced. The package is composed by more than one legal instrument. One of them is related to law enforcement purposes. Here, the criticism or by data protection authorities are more specific. What are the benefits of this approach? Why insisting on legal rules? We think it's time to have a more predictable legal environment. So, in principle, one single law for data protection in Europe, although we have a lot of discussions about some details, how much the regulation will build on existing national laws, which margin of maneuver will be offered to member states, particularly on certain sectors. You simply imagine the welfare area, not speaking about possible adjustments and derogations, particularly in the area of the public sector. But another element is to be now highlighted. It's a positive shift from a notification regime to an accountability approach, with a view also to simplify burdens and costs on controllers and processors of data. So controllers, by a legal viewpoint, and to a certain extent processors, will have to take necessary measure to ensure compliance, to translate this principle into practice, and to be able to demonstrate, where necessary, that they comply. So the modalities of this accountability principle will have to be defined further, also in terms of scalability, also in terms of documentation. But this is a clear trend which seems to have a large consensus at European level. The security of processing operation is to be reinforced, not speaking about reinforced cooperation between DPAs in terms of joint enforcement actions, in terms of legal assistance, but also perhaps through a consistency mechanism to be better defined in terms of selectivity. We are speaking with one voice about the need to consider the so-called lead authority as a primus inter pares, playing a role not simply in consultation with others, but in full cooperation. And it's crucial to also highlight the international dimension of this regulation, which will be applied if the current text will be adopted as it is now, not only to controllers established in the EU, but also to those offering goods and services being established outside the EU or monitoring their behavior. So we think that this approach constitutes a huge step forward for data protection in Europe. And we can conclude by saying that fairness and lawfulness in our viewpoint will be largely based on legal rules, including those on accountability and not simply on soft law. Of course, if you have a look to a couple of articles in the regulation, you will find interesting references to Code of Conduct, Article 38 of the regulation, by also speaking about best practices. So there is also a margin of maneuver for controllers to be proactive by also making use of certification mechanisms, data protection seals, not speaking about the same accountability principle. Of course, we are closely following developments in other areas. We recently started an analysis of relationship between binding corporate rules and other corporate rules in APEC area. My final comment in 1 second is to highlight, to draw your attention on the role of independent supervisory authority. In October 16, the European Court of Justice has adopted another judgment concerning the independency of a national DPA. There are very interesting references we may comment in another stage by insisting on not simply on the need to have sufficient resources, but with a view to deal or what it means independence in the day-to-day life with regard to relationship with the government.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, finally, in order to get the state of play fully visible, Bruno, on the transborder and international sort of effect that the legal framework might have as a result. Bruno.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for inviting me in your panel. I will briefly address how our proposed regulation deal with the international dimension of data flows. You were quoting the Beatles saying we can work it out. I would love to answer yes, we can. But I don't know if this is appropriate in these electoral times. But more seriously, we all agree that in a globalized environment, our respective system cannot and do not work in isolation. In particular, sharing data has become a crucial factor for economic growth. At the same time, our citizens expect that their data are well protected, including when they are transferred abroad. And in our system, they are entitled to that on the basis, first and foremost, of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. Or to put it in another way, the globalization of personal data flows should not come at the expense of the fundamental rights to the protection of personal information. This is the starting point of our approach to the type of issues we are discussing in this panel. And this is precisely why one of the objectives of the regulation is to facilitate and simplifying international data transfers while ensuring continuity of the individual's right to data protection. How is this achieved in our proposed regulation? In two ways. First, and this has just been mentioned, by ensuring that data subjects in the EU are not deprived of the protection they're entitled to under the regulation when their personal data are processed by a controller who is not established in the EU. The regulation will apply when a third country data controller offers goods or service to EU data subject or otherwise monitor their behavior, target such individuals. Second approach of the regulation, extension and in many ways streamlining and simplification of the provisions on international transborder flows. In particular, the proposed regulation extends the range of tools available to legitimize cross-border transfers, including to those countries which are not subject to a Commission adequacy finding. Let me just mention some examples. The draft regulation provides for the explicit legal recognition of binding corporate rules, including for data processor and standard contractual clauses, which can greatly simplify cross-border transfers. This goes together with the elimination in the large majority of the cases of the requirement to obtain the authorization of the supervisory authority before transferring data outside the EU. We are also introducing some elements of accountability, allowing the controller or processor to make their own assessment of the circumstances surrounding a certain data transfer if they provide appropriate safeguards in that respect, as well as the possibility under certain conditions to rely for international transfer on non-binding instruments such as code of conduct or memorandum of understanding. Finally, let me say some words on adequacy. As regards adequacy too, our proposal contains some important elements of clarification and predictability, in particular by expressly specifying the criteria that the Commission will give consideration to for assessing the level of data protection in a third country. In this respect, it is interesting to note that the list of criteria include international commitments entered by the candidate country. This will probably increase the relevance and the attractiveness of such international instruments by facilitating the approval of adequacy findings concerning countries that are parties to this instrument. This could be seen as in a certain sense, as a useful contribution towards interoperability via the channels of some international instrument. There's an important, further important element of flexibility and clarification, which somewhat expands the scope of this mechanism by explicitly providing that adequacy decision may cover not only an entire country, but also a territory of a sector within that country. This express reference to partial or sectoral adequacy may prove useful if in the future the Commission would look at complex system which with a multi-layer privacy regime made up of rules of different nature, scope, and where some sector, for instance, of the economy might, for instance, be subject to more detailed or stringent rules. So I guess I will end here. This is a rather rich and diverse toolbox as far as international transfers are concerned.
Thank you very much, Bruno. Now, that's the state of play, so to say. So we will take the floor again, all four of us, on the second question afterwards, and that's the question, what are the differences and how are we going to cope with them in order to get globalized sort of data protection amongst others? But for the time being, just to see whether there's questions about what I might call the state of play, the differences in approach, fierce enforcement on the one hand, on the other hand, legal rules being made on the third hand in the Asian Pacific countries, work in progress, but work together in a closely relationship, and all have differences, but that's the state of play. Is there anyone who wants to be more, who wants one of the speakers here to go more in detail, or shall we just go to the second question now, which then would be, and what are the differences and how are we going to cope with them? Is there any question now? You may just... You need not sing the question. It's okay, very clear. Let's go to the second part then. And we agreed again that it would be a short intervention of what's the problem and how are we going to solve it. And may I start again with Joni?
Sure. So happy to. So, you know, there are a lot of similarities, I think, between the efforts underway in the United States and the efforts underway in Europe. But I should probably start out by saying, as Alan pointed out, the United States is very, very active in the APEC efforts, the efforts to develop rules for interoperability and cross-border data flows. And as Alan pointed out, the United States was the first nation to seek accreditation through the system, and we've been very involved in development of the rules and development of the accountability structures that are the core component of the APEC rules. So we kind of sit between you know, what's happening in Europe and what's happening in Pacific, and are very involved with both. But with the APEC system, they're really I mean, it is a different system than what we have in the United States, but I think the end goal will be very similar, which is having a system of enforceable codes of conduct which have that backstop, that first word, enforceable, will have the backstop enforcement of governments. And we at the Federal Trade Commission plan to be very active in enforcing any problems that may arise through the APEC rules, and any company that isn't abiding by them, you know, we will take a very, very hard, close look at that. So what I'd like to do with the little time I have, thank you, is focus a little bit more on some of the similarities and differences between us and the European structure. You know, as Jakob mentioned, and as I mentioned, there's so much technological change going on that all data protection regulators are facing that it makes sense that we're all looking at how to reframe our laws, our rules, and our perspective. And that is what's going on both in the United States and Europe. And many of the ideas that are being discussed in Europe are ideas that either exist in the United States or are under active discussion. So for instance, as I mentioned, privacy by design, that's something that is very much a part of the reworking of the frameworks in both areas, both the United States and in Europe. Children's privacy. This is an area that the United States has legislated in, and the proposed regulation has a number of points that deal with children's privacy. They aren't identical. That is, it isn't identical between the United States and Europe, but it's similar enough that you can see that we're heading in the same direction, in my view. Data breach notification. This is an issue that has been dealt with more at the state level in the United States. That is, there's no federal law requiring notification of consumers when there has been a data breach involving their own data, but the states, some 45 plus of them, have enacted laws requiring such notification. And we at the Federal Trade Commission have called for Congress to enact a federal law that would set some very robust standards and hopefully bring a little bit of consistency to it in the United States. And much of what's being discussed in Europe on this issue, I think, is similar. Certainly the overall effort is similar. There's one issue with respect to data breach notification where we are in active discussion with our European friends, and that deals with the initial call to have notification within 24 hours. Because I worked for many, many years at the state level, I know that giving notification to consumers within 24 hours of a breach could present some real practical problems. And the most fundamental of those problems is that oftentimes what the Europeans would call a data controller, what we would call a company, needs to really figure out what happened and needs to bring in law enforcement, that is criminal law enforcement, to try to determine whether or not they can catch the bad guys. And if you notify consumers about what has happened, you're also notifying the bad guys that you know what has happened, and that can present a real problem in terms of catching them long term. And I've worked on cases with criminal law enforcement where they asked for a little bit of time so that they could try to catch the bad guys in the act of taking more data out. So it's something that we're working with our European friends to communicate what our experience in this area has been, so that we can help them develop a law that they believe will be the most robust and helpful to consumers. So let's turn to codes of conduct, because the regulation, the proposed regulation in Europe, does appear to mention codes of conduct, but it's not clear to us exactly what role they will have. And we are in discussion with our European friends to try to encourage the use and the implementation of more enforceable, robust codes of conduct. We think we have some good examples. We think the EU-US Safe Harbor has been a good example of a interoperability system that is fundamentally founded on a code of conduct. We in the United States have enforced the Safe Harbor in a number of cases, including the very big ones that I mentioned. Every single enforcement case that we bring, we look at whether or not there is an EU-US Safe Harbor issue. And anytime the Europeans bring to us a case that may raise the issue, we take it very seriously and take a very close examination of it. So we think that there's been good experience with enforceable codes of conduct. We think that what it can do, what enforceable codes of conduct can do, and what APEC demonstrates, it's another example of it. It demonstrates how you can take countries that do have different perspectives, different social history, different values, in essence. You take these countries that have these differences, and yet you can try to make things work together so that they are interoperable. And what needs to be kept in mind is consumers will benefit if there is a lot of innovation. And innovation does require data flow. It just does. And so we need to make sure that we can make innovation happen in a way that's robust, that will benefit consumers, but also in a way that will protect them in a robust fashion. So that's our goal. That's what we hope to communicate to our European friends. And we are in pretty active discussion with them about how we can make these enforceable codes of conduct have a potentially greater role in the European context as the proposed regulation goes forward.
Well, thank you very much. Then we go to Alan. What differences do you see, and how are we going to overcome them, Alan?
Right. I think one unique characteristic in the Asia-Pacific region, particularly in the Asia region, I would say, is that there's a diversity in the this area, in the development, in the data protection. For example, Hong Kong, we have our legislation on data protection in year 1995. At that time, I guess we were the first Asian economy that has a dedicated piece of legislation on data protection. But then things change. You know, the updated statistics show that we have now in the Asia region, 10 more countries or jurisdictions which have similar legislation either already in place or have legislation already enacted but awaiting to become operational, or in the form of a bill awaiting approval in the legislature. So things are moving very quickly compared with some 16 years ago, I would say. So what will happen in the coming couple of years? I think a lot will happen. Maybe a lot of more APEC countries will join this forum. This is my prediction. Interoperability, right. The ideal would be have a universal set of principles adopted by all jurisdictions, but that, I guess, is a dream, you know. We all need to have a dream to start with, but then apart from dreaming, we still have day-to-day issues that we need to tackle, and on a very practical basis, there are a lot of initiatives that has already taken place. I'll give you some examples. I just talk about the APEC CP PR system, cross-border privacy rule system that has been installed just this year. Already, the APEC ministers have agreed to a proposal to match the APEC CPPR system with the European corporate binding rule system. And I think they have written to Article 29 Working Party to confirm whether this is feasible. And if yes, then the work will start. So that's one initiative. On a country basis, in Hong Kong, for example, in our legislation, I am empowered to draw a white list of jurisdictions where Hong Kong companies can export personal data for business reasons, and at the same time, with the confidence that these will be the jurisdictions that they can trust. So I haven't come up with that white list yet, because that piece of law has yet to be confirmed by government with the real operational date to be decided by them. But already at this point in time, I am undertaking a consultancy study to come up with a draft whitelist of these jurisdictions, and that will lead to perhaps a proper consultation in Hong Kong. So something might happen in the coming 1 or 2 years again. And another example is, I'm just quoting what happened in New Zealand with Blair, who may confirm, or if I'm misquoting New Zealand. New Zealand has taken the initiative, for example, to apply for the status of adequacy by the European Union. and they got it. So on a country basis, they already got the interoperability enforced. So I think that again is an example of what can happen in absence of a universal set of principles. I guess I've stopped here, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Same question to Giovanni and to Bruno. What are the differences and how are we going to surmount them? Go ahead.
From the European Data Protection Supervisor viewpoint, I had the privileged chance to see that in different countries we speak much more a similar, not identical language. Of course, privacy is a global matter and needs of a more global response. But I see more and more countries adopting data protection laws. I see a decreasing trend in fragmenting different approaches on data protection. So an increasing number of countries now acknowledge the importance of data protection rules, while other countries are, in any event, moving to address the protection of personal information in ways that both reflect their particular legal, political, and cultural realities, but also the global flows of personal information. Of course, the challenge is now on how we can attain more convergence between the various systems. During the conference in Jerusalem, a resolution was passed asking for the organization of an intergovernmental conference with a view to develop a binding international instrument on privacy and data protection. Question is now, should we successfully proceed with this idea in mind? Should we proactively invent a new mechanism? An international legal framework could help in, of course, reducing diversities, taking into account cultural differences and certain differences between sectors. And I think we will continue to explore the feasibility of a binding international framework. In the meantime, other categories of standards and perhaps joint enforcement initiatives may play a role. So interoperability is perhaps a key word, and perhaps is also something relevant to be reasonably positive in the short-term perspective. I was impressed by one sentence in the executive summary of the White House paper describing the main lines of the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights, the one with regard to respect for context. If you see the reference, consumers have a right to expect that companies, not public bodies, will collect, use, and disclose personal data in ways that are consistent with the context in which consumers provide the data. So it's a different way to highlight a principle which in Europe perhaps is considered within the rules of fairness and proportionality. Compared to last year, we have some interesting developments to mention. For instance, those relating to the international enforcement meeting that took place in Montreal in May this year, involving a lot of GPEN members. So being realistic, perhaps cooperation between law enforcement entities, not only data protection authorities, is key in the short term. So it's perhaps too early to have one size fits for all. And actually, it's a step-by-step approach. What we can do, perhaps we may start by translating into practice the recent Privacy and Data Protection Commissioner's resolutions, not only those on international enforcement cooperation. We may perhaps better discuss with our governments with a view to review where necessary existing legislation to facilitate greater cooperation. We may build upon existing cooperation measures by reducing barriers to cooperation. It's not only an issue for more synchronization or timetabling or avoiding duplication and overlapping. It's time to perhaps promoting a single data protection community building on existing differences. This implies to better share information about potential or existing investigations or enforcement actions by also facilitating possible coordination also with regard to the interpretation of certain principles. So it's a broad spectrum of solutions, not necessarily alternative to each other. So it's perhaps time to have a roadmap with certain selected objectives and priorities, by being ambitious in the long term with regard to a more robust legal framework at worldwide level, but by being a little bit more pragmatic in the short one. So perhaps we may clarify the application of certain key principles on privacy and data protection, innovate their implementation, and better work on the way in which accountability is implemented, not speaking about the transborder data flows.
Thank you very much. Bruno.
Thank you. Interoperability and cooperation with third countries are key priorities. This is absolutely clear to us, and it's notably reflected in the fact that the proposed regulation strongly encourages international cooperation in the field of data protection and privacy. As Giovanni was suggesting, the final objective may be to have common international standards on data protection on a global scale, but this, as we all know, is a long-term, if not a very long-term objective. And in the meantime, there are more immediate and direct ways to promote greater convergence between a privacy regime. The EU is actively engaged in that work, both at bilateral and multilateral level. At bilateral level, we maintain a constant dialogue with a large number of international partners, and actually we tend to see that privacy is increasingly becoming a key item on the trade agenda of many countries. This is the case, for instance, in the current negotiation we have on a free trade agreement with India. Probably the most developed dialogue we have is, of course, with the US. While regulatory regimes in the field of data protection differ between the US and Europe, there's a strong mutual interest and commitment to advance the transatlantic dialogue to resolve the shared privacy challenge. This has been reaffirmed in several recent joint statements, including one between Presidents Obama and Barroso. And as we know, the EU and US do cooperate on the protection of personal data in different areas, both commercial and law enforcement. In particular, the Safe Harbor scheme has been in place now for more than 10 years. This scheme has proved to be a useful vehicle for enhancing data protection in the transatlantic context, and we appreciate the efforts, and many have been just mentioned, undertaken by the US authorities, and in particular by the FTC, to police compliance with the Safe Harbor rules. In particular, we took note with great interest of the references made in the FTC settlement agreements, Facebook and Google, to the need to avoid misrepresentation of compliance with the Safe Harbor scheme. And this is certainly a very good basis to further intensify our cooperation and further improve the enforcement of the Safe Harbor rules. In this context, we're also looking with great interest at the recent initiative undertaken by the Obama administration in the area of privacy, and which have been extensively described. While, unlike in Europe, you're looking for differences, there is no single overarching privacy legislation in the US yet. A first step has been taken in that direction last February with the launch of the US Privacy Blueprint, and this could bring the two systems closer and thereby facilitate interoperability between our regime. But actually, this is a particular crucial moment. There's a momentum maybe to size, since privacy rules are being discussed and reformed more or less at the same time on both sides of the Atlantic. And this might offer opportunities to explore additional mechanisms to favor convergence or interoperability. For instance, Vice President Reding was recently suggesting that the safe harbor could represent a useful source of inspiration for the codes of conduct which are to be developed through a multi-stakeholder process and which are being developed through a multi-stakeholder process as part of the US Privacy Blueprint Initiative. To quote Vice President Reding, this is a low-hanging fruit we could harvest together, given that about 3,000 US businesses have already signed up to the safe harbor scheme. Moving very quickly, I understand, to the multilateral dimension of our international work, there are also particularly interesting development in that front, with a number of instruments being reformed and modernized, the OECD guidelines, the Convention 108, or other mechanisms emerging, such as those in the context of APEC. We very much welcome this development, and we participate actively to the works, in particular of the OECD and the Council of Europe. We believe that this type of instrument play a very important role by laying down a core of shared principles that set an international standard and could be the basis of further progress in the direction of greater convergence or interoperability. That's also why we look with great interest at the work undertaken in particular by CNIL on issues of comparability between the EU BCRs and the APEC CBR system. I could say more about the OECD and the Council of Europe, but I see that I have to stop. I will just say on this last example I mentioned, this study of the comparability, that this could be a very innovative and promising way to address the question of how to connect different systems.
Well, thank you very much. I was just asked by the organization, because of the president coming to close the session, we have no time left, although this session would still have 10 minutes. We were planning to be short in our intervention, and it has at least 10 or 15 minutes with the audience, but they were taken away. Now I will, so I'm very sorry, but we're not able to give you the floor. And I think that the best way to proceed now is all of us, just 1 minute. Where will we be in 2 or 3 years or 5 years' time? What are we heading for, and how are we going to do that? Because if I've been listening to all your interventions right now, there are differences, and we didn't even touch on explicit consent, purpose limitation, and definition of personal data, which are, of course, also within the scope of the discussion. We didn't define yet the buzzword interoperability. Is it like the Beatles, try to see it my way, or is it more than that? But all of us would want to make a step forward. So where are we going to be within a couple of years from now? And I start with Julie. And just 1 minute, because we need to
move on.
Move on.
Yes. So, you know, I agree that this is a crucial time. I very much agree with Bruno, and there's a lot of discussion underway. And I wish I did have a crystal ball. So, for instance, I wish I could say that in the United States we will have comprehensive privacy legislation. We will have legislation dealing with data brokers. We will have a robust W3C do not track system that works across borders. At this point in time, I'm not sure I can say that with respect to any of those things, although I can certainly tell you that I'm very hopeful that all three will be implemented within the next, with respect to W3C, I actually hope that will happen much sooner, but that would be sort of a 6-month to 2-year timeline. I'm very hopeful those things will happen. but please don't take my hope as being a prediction that in fact they will happen. Much more realistically, I do think that there will be accountability systems, interoperability systems up and running, specifically and especially through APEC, but also I hope more so with respect to Europe and the United States. I really do believe that that's the way to go, because while binding corporate rules and the EU-US safe harbor can work on a company-by-company basis, I think that we need to develop systems that are more efficient and more easily usable by everybody, and yet still very protective of consumer privacy.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alan. Same question.
Same question. My response will be first, as I said, lots of developments going on in Asia Pacific. So I expect in 1 or 2 years' time, we'll be able to see in international conferences of this kind, more Asian faces. So more jurisdictions from Asia will come on board. That's my prediction. The other thing is, I think, well, very quickly we will have more operating experience in terms of cooperation among the privacy enforcement authorities, and I hope we will quickly have real experiences and we'll be able to reveal what works or what doesn't work, and then we can really have some very concrete framework to guide us for future successful international cooperation among us. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. Giovanni?
Perhaps in 2 years from now, we will have a robust regulation in Europe, the Bill of Rights submitted to the US Congress, both with the necessary improvements. In the meantime, I will be satisfied if at least 2 of the principles which now appear on the OECD draft guidelines will be implemented by the relevant partners. I'm speaking about an ongoing draft which is not final, but there are 2 interesting references. The first one related to the need to develop national data protection strategies that recognize the importance of protecting privacy and reflect a coordinated approach across government. And the second one is the need to encourage the development of multi-jurisdictional arrangements that give effect to data protection principles regardless the personal information location. From some presentations yesterday and today, we got the confirmation that information processing is growing more and more invisible, intangible, less and less controllable. So it's time to make, on the contrary, privacy policies, not only by controllers, but by also enforcement bodies, more visible. If this will be the case, I will be ready to sing Lady Gaga, which is much more difficult than singing Beatles.
Bruno.
I'm not going to sing, but if the regulation is adopted, I'm going to sing. But no, what I see are 2 different and apparently contradictory trends, but actually that might complement each other. I see certainly, probably more convergence on issue that seems very controversial, like the need to have a legislative or regulatory framework, and at the same time, I see the need to be more creative and especially as far as international transfer are concerned, find new innovative tools and systems, and that's why I was mentioning that interesting example of the BCI and CBPR comparison. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And as far as I'm concerned, my dream is to be conductor of the International Data Protection Choir, and then we'll all sing together. Hopefully, being all of us will agree that there's a lot of work to be done, but that we really, as data protection family sitting here, we think that there's differences, but we shall and need to overcome these differences, because for the goal we're heading for, it is an absolute necessity to do that. Thank you very much, all of you, for being with us.
Very nice job. Very nice job.
Okay.
Muchas gracias a los señores panelistas, además por haber acortado el tiempo. Agradecemos a Jacob Constant, los expositores invitados, Julie Brill, Alan Chang y Giovanni Buttarelli, además del señor Bruno Gencarelli. Como decía el señor Jacob hace unos minutos, por situaciones que se han dado en la agenda del señor Presidente de la República, se adelanta todo para las 5:30 de la tarde, es decir, se elimina el café no va a estar ahora, va a ser luego de la clausura y los dos paneles que siguen se van a juntar y acortar en el tiempo, por lo cual le vamos a pedir obviamente a los coordinadores y moderadores de los paneles que eliminen también el espacio de preguntas. Así que todo esto se va a ir transformando en unos minutos para esperar la llegada del señor Presidente de la República. Aguardamos unos minutitos para que ingrese el próximo panel. Entre tanto, les cuento algo, que aquellas personas que requieran un certificado de asistencia a la conferencia lo van a tener disponible en la web a partir de la primera semana del mes de noviembre. Va a estar allí en la web para todos aquellos que requieran ese certificado.